Hello. Okay, so good morning. My name is Benchok Vugu. I'm the training coordinator for 7 Minutes for Girls. I'll be the moderator for today's session. So welcome to the first session of Content 101 series. So Content 101 series is a content building workshop facilitated by 7 Minutes for Girls team. The purpose of this series is to help bridge the gap in content accessibility and comprehension for the female debater in West Africa. Through our research and study, we came to a conclusion that one of the reasons for low participation in debate, apart from finance, is having inadequate grasp over concepts that we talk about in debate rounds. 7 Minutes for Girls being dedicated in helping to promote female participation in West Africa deemed it right to help solve this problem. The first edition of this series will cover 7 diverse topics that are crucial to debating motions and will last for the next 2 months. Our first speaker is the person of Mr. Suleiman Bello. He is a political enthusiast and a graduate from the University of Ghana, where he studied Bachelor of Arts in Political Science with Philosophy. He was also a panelist on Good Evening Ghana on Metro TV. Please note that, please can you unmute yourself? Please note that this session is being streamed live on YouTube. So I encourage everyone to please unmute themselves. If you have any questions while the session is ongoing, please type them out. There'll be time for you to ask the questions. So at no point in time should we be interrupted or the speaker. We don't want the speaker to be interrupted whilst he's having his session. We'll let you know when it's time for questions. So without much ado, let's welcome the speaker, Mr. Suleiman. Thank you. Mr. Suleiman, please, are you there? You can start now. Hello. So sorry, we just contacted the speaker. He's having a few issues connecting, so he will start his delivery very soon.
Hello? Hello?
Hello, sir. Please, you are audible.
Okay, okay. So, until later, if she has to do the introduction, I could start right away.
Yes, please, you can start.
Okay. All right, before I start, let me welcome everyone on this program. Can you hear me?
Am I audible? Please, you are audible. Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Well, the topic initially, when I got the information, I was a bit skeptical about the topic because it's quite complicated. But then I hope before the end of the program, we get to understand the nuances, the complexities, and the origin of some of these confrontations and why Middle East has always remained a hotspot historically. But to understand the Middle East as we have it today, we need to take a detour back to history. So somewhere around, I think, 1914 to 1918, during the World War I. You know, the World War I featured two hostile camps in Europe. Basically, the Central Powers made up of Germany, Serbia, Austria-Hungary, and then, unfortunately, the Ottoman Empire, which ruled vast territory of the current Middle East, also sided with the Central Powers, as against the triplet entity made up of Britain, France, Russia, and then some minor powers also. But then, at the end of the war, the Central Powers, that is Germany and its allies, lost the war. So they had their empires, eviscerated, as in collapsed and divided among the victors. So what happened is that was how come we have the current borders or nations of the Middle East. After the defeat of Ottoman Empire, Britain and France shared a territory among themselves. And one very important thing that happened in that period was the promise, somewhere around 1917, there was a promise by Lord Balfour in Balfour Declaration to give the Jews a homeland in historic Palestine, which is normally called the Holy Lands. And I'm sure we know the tension between the Palestinians and the Israelites. While it looks altruistic, it looks, humanistic, that the Jews are being sent to the Holy Land. But one fundamental thing that we mustn't forget is that itself is xenophobia. You may not have heard this thing on international media because they would like to throw dust in our eyes. The Jews have been outside the Holy Lands for almost a million years, a millennia. And all of a sudden, you are promising to return them back to a perceived ancestral land. This is technically ethnic cleansing. It was Europe bundling the people it doesn't want to be part of its society because the Jews were dominant across almost all the sectors of European life. A famous Jew you might not know is Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein is a German Jew. Even the famous Karl Marx, the proponent of Marxism, was a German Jew by origin. These people were dominant in all sectors, from academia to commerce to literature, art, but they were never fully integrated into European society. I can't remember the exact year, but we had several programs, especially in the eastern part of Europe. Somewhere around 1912, the Museum Moscow also. So the Jews were part of European society for almost a million years, but they were never integrated. So the promise of giving them, taking them back to their ancestral land itself is ethnic cleansing. It's like sending people you don't want. And that accounts for why today, no matter how Israel disregards international law, the European powers and America still side with Israel. Because In the first place, they took them there. So they have to protect the entity they took over there. I'm not saying that, what do you call it? The Jews might not have affiliations with that part of the land. But you can't come to a place where you meet people and you want to vanquish them out of that territory and impose your rule. It doesn't work that way. You either live with them or you don't come at all. To want to come and impose your own order on people is technically, what do you call it? Impossible. It's practically impossible, not even technically. So by 1936, there was this large influx, there was this mandated territory. We'll get to see it. Some territories were given to France and Britain as a joint mandate. But for administrative convenience, they had to partition it. For example, Lebanon was part of Syria in the Ottoman era, but it was partitioned for administrative convenience between the British and the French. And that is why today there's a tense relationship between Syria and Lebanon. And that is why Syria has always sought to influence or dominate Lebanon politics, because it still considers Lebanon to be part of its territory. And I'm sure you heard of the famous Iran-Iraq War of 1992, the Gulf War. The genesis of that war can be traced back to how those countries decided to administer the territory they were given as custody or a trust on behalf of the League of Nations. But then, by 1936, there was huge influx of Jews.
Hello, Mr. Suleiman, please, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm there. Just a minute.
Okay, sure.
No. No, about it. I'm going to follow slide in the bata. I want to get a blend again. Well, I'll still come back to what is on the slide. I'm only laying a preamble so that when I go into the slide, because I tried as much as I can to compress events so you don't be confused or find it difficult to follow the trend of what is there. So forgive me for that. I should have informed you earlier. So hence, the root of the modern day conflict in Middle East. So now let's look at the countries in the Middle East and then their, what do you call it, government structure. So there's always this tension between the Jews that came in and the Arabs who were in Palestine, and then leads to a lot of conflict. Israel was created, I think, around 1948. But the Middle Eastern countries can be divided into classes. We have the monarchies, we have the democracies, and we have the dictatorship. I have listed them there, but one thing I must make very clear is that the division or the differences, it's very, very fluid. Because some of the so-called democracies in the Middle East are not as democratic as we know a genuine democratic state. Perhaps they could be more described as a blend of, what do you call it, democracy and some kind of authoritarianism. But then, for sake of honesty and then being fair with them, I have decided to put them in stages. So for the monarchists, we can talk about the Qataris, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Kuwait. There are equally some distinctions between these monarchies I have listed here. In the case of Kuwait, for example, Kuwait is a monarchy just like the United Arab Emirates. But whilst the United Arab Emirates does not have a parliament, an official parliament, all it has is an advisory council with limited powers of just advising the, the emir or the king. In the case of Kuwait, parliament is elected on a non-partisan basis. Parliament has the power to scrutinize the budget, approve the budget, or review the budget. Parliament has power to either reject law and send it back to the king for consideration or amendment. Aside that, Parliament does not appoint the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister is appointed by the Emir. So you could now see that in as much as it is a monarchy, it has some semblance of democracy that distinguish it from its sheikdoms, as they are called, like Qatar, United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain. And then the democracies in Middle East are very few. By Middle East in this context, I'm excluding the Northern African countries because the focus is more largely on the Asian side. But when we talk about the Northern African part of the Middle East, then we can talk about Tunisia as a democracy. We can cite, what do you call this country? If we go by procedural basis, having elections periodically, then we can add Algeria to a democracy. We can talk about Morocco being a constitutional monarchy, that is, if you are to talk about the Northern Africa. But for the sake of our topic today, I'm restricting myself to the Arabian Gulf. That's the Asian side of the Middle East, not the North African part of it. So countries like Israel, Lebanon, and Iraq would constitute what we call a democracy within that region. But mind you, of all these three, Israel appears to be genuinely democratic. But regardless of that, the Israeli, system has equally discriminatory policies towards its own Arab citizens. You know, when Israel, back to the, the origin of the state, when the Jews were brought into historic Palestine, series of clashes, the Jews emerged victorious. There was ethnic cleansing. A lot of the Arabs fled the part that became Israel today, but some refused to migrate and stayed. And they constitute about 4 to 5% of Israeli population. They constitute a minority actually. But the laws in Israel does not respect their rights, their freedom, and their entitlement as citizens. There's a law passed by the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, recently, that categorically stated that Israel is a Jewish state. How can a democracy be tilted towards favoring one side against the other? Because if you say that Israel is, a Jewish state, you are discriminating against your own Arab population. So what of all the three I've listed in the slide, Israel appears to be the most democratic. Israel still remains a society with trappings that is similar to the apartheid regime in South Africa. Lebanon, on the other hand, it's a democracy with a very complex arrangement. Because of its sectarian makeup, it has about 20 or more recognized sects in Lebanon, but the largest are the Christians, the Sunni Muslims, and the Shia Muslims. And within these three huge sects, within Lebanon also, the Shia tend to be more than the remaining two. But upon the attainment of independence, somewhere in the 60s, the power structure that was left by the French was more in favor of the Christians and the Sunni Muslims to the detriment of the Shia majority. And then geographically, there's another peculiarity with Lebanon. The south is predominantly Shia. They were oppressed. They were marginalized by the post-colonial state that was left. And power was in the hands of the Sunnis and the Shia. And uniquely, per the Lebanese constitution, only a Christian could be the president. Only a Sunni Muslim could be the prime minister. And only a Shia Muslim will hold the office of the of the Speaker of Parliament. But as it is today, tables have turned, and that is ruffling shoulders. We'll still get to that. And then elections in Lebanon are not conducted based on the, what do you call it? Universal adult, no, there's this universal adult suffrage, but they are not conducted based on, what do you call it? Secret ballot as we have it, where political parties are allowed. It is conducted on a list, on a sectarian list. So each sect is represented. It's more like a proportional representation. But unlike the European proportional representations, where it is based on parties, in the Lebanese situation, the proportional representation is actually based on sectarian divide of the country. Because aside the, what do you call it, the three that I've mentioned, you have other sects like the Druze, the Alawites. So there are others like that, about 32 recognized also. And then Iraq, prior to the US invasion, will have constituted a dictatorship. But with the advent of the American occupation in 2003 and the subsequent restoration of self-rule in Iraq, Iraq became a democracy with a similar sectarian distribution of power as we have it in Lebanon. But what's in the Lebanese situation, it is categorically stated by the law. In the Iraqi situation, for example, is more like a gentleman's agreement, because Iraq has its own ethnic makeup of the Kurds in the northern part of the country, the Sunnis, I think, around the western part, somewhere around Amba, Fallujah, and Mosul. And then places like Basra have huge, what do you call it, Shia population. So per the Iraqi tacit agreement, you have a Kurd occupying the position of the presidency, you have the Speaker of Parliament going to the Sunnis, and you have the Prime Minister's office occupied by a Shia. But once in Lebanon, it is categorically stated by law. In the Iraqi instance, it is not stipulated by law. It's more like a mutual or gentleman's agreement between the political faction in the country. And so at the moment, there's a lot of, the current election result has changed the dynamics, and there's a lot of tension around that aspect of the country. But then we will still get to that. And then we have the Theocratic States. And even the line of theocracy is equally very, very blurred. Saudi Arabia is a monarchy. That is, if you go by the system, its governance system. But the fact that it does not have a constitution of its own, and consider the Quran, the Hadith, and the, what do you call it, Sunnah of the Prophet as its core constitution, also makes it a theocracy. And that is why I've labeled it, what do you call it, monarchical theocracy. And the legitimacy of the ruling house stems from the fact that they are in custody of the two sacred mosques of Islam. That is the Holy Mosque in Mecca and the Prophet Mosque in Medina. So legitimacy of the Saudi royal family is derived on the fact that they are supposed to be protectors of Islam and custodians of the sacred mosques. Iran is equally a theocratic state with a semblance of democracy. In Iran, the power structure is divided between the elected offices, that is the democratic aspect of the state, and the revolutionary offices, that is the theocratic dimension or theocratic vestige of state power. For example, whilst the president is elected, in reality, his function is nothing different from the prime minister of France, whom is at the mercy of the president. Once the president in Iran is elected, he is not the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. He does not appoint the chief justice. He does not appoint the attorney general. He is not basically in charge of even foreign policy itself. So in as much as he's elected by the people, he has limited power and scope of maneuver within the system. The supreme leader has the purview of those powers I have stated that the president does not have. And unlike Saudi Arabia, in Iran, the supreme leader is elected through a different process than that of the prime minister and the president. The president is elected by adult suffrage. The parliament is elected by universal adult suffrage. But in the case of the supreme leader, he is elected by the Guardian Council. It's a council of 12 jurists, Islamic jurists, that sit and decide on who. No. There's a council itself that elects, what do you call it? That is the discernment council. Those are elected councils, but only Islamic scholars could contest. Only Islamic scholars could contest for those elections in electing the discernment council. Then the discernment council in return elect the supreme leader. But since the founding of the republic in 1979, it has just two supreme leaders. The current one, who has been serving since 1980s, I can't remember the exact date, and the founder of the Islamic Republic himself, Ruhullah Musavi Khomeini, so far. And then the duty of monitoring or supervising the supreme leader falls on the shoulders of the Guardian Council. Theoretically, the Guardian Council looks independent, but in practice, he appoints members of the Guardian Council, and that gives him more power over them. So, in as much as Iran has a trappings of democracy, it's equally theocratic. So it's more like a democracy with a theocracy with democratic features. In as much as Saudi is a monarchy, it is a monarchy with theocratic influences. And then there's another important factor we must note here. In Islam, we have multiple sects. We have the Sunni being the largest. We have the Shia. We have the Ibadis. We have the Quraniyun. We have the Ahmadis. But the two largest known sects in Islam are the Sunni and the Shia. And historically, these sects have a lot of differences that at a certain point in time has led to conflict in the past. At a certain point in time, dialogue. But in this current situation, in this current atmosphere, Iran is the leading Shia power in that region. Saudi Arabia is the leading Sunni power in that region. There's another clash between these two countries causing conflict within the Middle East as at now. And now let's get to the conflict itself. I think I've spoken a little on the Arab-Israeli conflicts. But there are a series of, hold on a minute. There are a series of conflicts between the Israelis and the Arabs, and in most of these wars, Israel has always emerged victorious, starting from the ones in the early 30s, early 40s, which is more like a civil war between the Arabs and the Jews within the British mandated Palestine, to the creation of Israel in 1948. Post that, we had the Suez War, which was militarily a victory for Israel, but politically and strategically was an Egyptian victory. You have the 1967 war, the 5-day war, in which the 6-day war, in which Israel used 6 days to vanquish 5 Arab countries, comprising of Iraq, Syria, Egypt, I think Lebanon, if I'm not mistaken, and Saudi backings also. We had the 1973 war, the Yom Kippur War, which resulted in a stalemate between Egypt and Israel, and then led to the negotiation between the two countries for peace and the return of the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt by the Israelis. I think, okay, even on the slide, I have the list of the war. So we have the first war of 1948 to 1949. We have the, and this is more like a civil war, the 51 to 55, the Fedayeen insurgency. In all this war, Israel has been victorious, but two are quite controversial. The 1956 Swiss War was a political victory for the Egyptian government of Gamal Abdel Nasser. The Yom Kippur War was more like a stalemate without a clear winner. But the conflict that changed the situation happened in Lebanon. You know, when Israel was created, the Palestinians refused to accept defeat. They refused to recognize the right of the Israeli state to exist. They kept on attacking and harassing the new regime. And because, like I said in the beginning, the regime was purposefully created by Western powers to rid them of the burden of the Jews they never wanted to accept as part of their society. They kept backing Israel in all this confrontation, in all these escalations. So PLA was kicked out of what is today Israel, because when you look at the map, you hardly see Palestine. We'll get to that. And then I think one of the list of the countries, I listed Palestine as an unrecognized state because there are some countries around the world that have diplomatic dealings with Palestine and recognized as a state. I should have said that earlier. But when the PLA were kicked out of Israel, for the sake of convenience, let me say Israel, because historically that is Palestine. Israel is an imposition on that people. But we all have how we see the issue. But for the sake of political correctness, I will stick to what is on the map, Israel. They went into Lebanon. But mind you, I told you in Lebanese system is a sectarian system of governance, right? Where you have multiple sects. So the large influx, and the Palestinians are largely Sunni Muslims. So when they were kicked out of their homeland in Palestine or Israel, their migration into Lebanon created a problem. It altered the status quo of the population and the, what you call, sectarian makeup of that country, with a large influx of the Sunni Muslims. The Sunnis were increasing in their numbers as against other sides, and it created fear among other sects. And again, when the Palestinian organization, that is the PLO, Palestinian Liberation Front, that was the front fighting for the right of self-determination of the Palestinians. I'm sure you know of the famous Palestinian leader, Yasser Arafat. He was the founder or the leader of the group. When they got to Lebanon, they created a state within a state. And also were oppressing the Southern Lebanese. And mind you, the Southern Lebanese are historically Shia. But somewhere in the 70s, I think initially in 78, Israel invaded Lebanon with the purpose of expelling the Palestinian militants from Lebanon to secure its northern borders. It achieved its initial objective, withdrew. And then a civil war erupted in Lebanon, very violent one. Within that civil war itself, Israel invaded Lebanon again in 1982. And this invasion lasted for more than 20 years, because it ended in the year 2000. Within this period, Israelis created, and this happened at the time when the Lebanese Civil War was also ongoing between various factions. The Israelis created South Lebanese Army, which is more like a proxy they use in ruling or administering that territory. And a whole lot of human rights violation took place. And these militias were largely made up of Lebanese Christians. And the victims of their crimes were largely Lebanese Shias. Two countries intervened to thwart Israel in its venture here. One is Syria, the other is Iran. For the Syrians, mind you, I said I made mention of them being part of the coalition of Arabs that were defeated in the 1967 war. And they lost a portion of their territory, which is still under Israeli control today, the Golan Heights. So when Israel invaded Lebanon, they saw an advantage to humiliate Israel by backing those resisting Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon. So Syria intervened with troops to shore up the collapsing Syrian regime and also back resistant fighters in its attempt to undermine Israel. But within this period, the Islamists have also gained upper hand in Iran after the overthrow of the last Shah in 1979. And they are equally against Israel, just like the Arabs. But the Iranians, bear this in mind, Iranians are largely not Arabs. They are Persians, or Farsi, as they call themselves. But they have some Arab minorities around their borders with Iraq. But largely Iranians are not Arabs. But just like they are Sunni Muslims, they refuse to recognize the right of Israel to exist. So they also saw an advantage of undermining Israel in its venture in southern Lebanon. So they intervened. And between the Syrian intervention and the Iranian intervention, the most successful one was the Syrian intervention, they were able to bring a group of Shia militias of different competing factions together into one single entity today that is the most powerful entity in Lebanon today, the Lebanese Hezbollah. And that group has become the biggest nemesis of Israel in the region. Far stronger, far more determined, more resilient than any other opponent they have faced in their entire 70 plus years of existence in that region. So you could see that with the benefit of a hindsight, we could say that Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982 didn't achieve its strategic objective. Because when the Israeli troops occupied or invaded Lebanon, they were welcomed with rice and flowers, which is a tradition around that region. Within a short period of years, due to their heavy-handedness and their violation of the people's rights, the Lebanese Shia turned against them. And if there's any big criminal entity in terms of committing war crimes, Israel is number one. I know the proponent of Israel and its supporters would like to disagree. There is no way in international law that permits you to move a prisoner from an occupied territory into your territory. There are a lot of Lebanese prisoners languishing in Israeli jail whose only offense was resisting Israeli occupation of their territory. That itself is war crime. But of course, as an entity created by the West, to surely have their protection. And then there's another famous war. So from 1982 to 2000, Hezbollah kept fighting Israel till it voluntarily withdrew. And the word voluntary has been thrown out there by the international media, the CNN, all the likes, that Israel voluntarily withdrew. That is a big lie. The withdrawal was necessitated by the reality on the ground. They spent over 2 decades, millions of dollars, and could not achieve their political calculation in Lebanon, so they had to withdraw. So it was nothing voluntary. It was inevitable that they withdraw before it becomes a defeat. And again, in 2006, was another war between Hezbollah and Israel, and this resulted in a stalemate. This war was necessitated, the 2006 one precisely, was initiated by Hezbollah and not Israel. We must establish that fact also. In almost all the wars, The Arabs were, if we like to put it for the sake of political correctness, aggressors. But if we look at it from the perspective of people fighting for their land and for their self-determination, then Israel becomes the aggressor. But in the case of Lebanon, it is obviously clear that the aggressor in all the equation has always been Israel. And the balance that the international community, when I say international community, mind you, I'm referring to the West. I don't believe in the idea of international community. It's always been the West trying to impose issue on us. We've seen them trying to tell us gayism is human rights, international community, when it's against our culture. But for them, polygamy is against their culture. It is exclusivity. So I disagree with the issue of international community. I must admit, I'm not a believer in that balance. But for the sake of convenience, I will still remain within that scope. What they mean by Israel has the right to defend itself verbally is practically Israel has the right to commit every crime it chooses to commit in that region without accountability. Because we've seen attack on civilian facility. In the recent escalation in Gaza, we saw attack on hospital, media houses. Are these not war crimes? Have any Israeli been held accountable? The West and America continue to veto decisions on the Security Council that seek to hold Israel accountable. So the balance, Israel has the right to defend itself. Practically on the ground means Israel has the right to commit war crimes and get away with it. You can disagree with me, but the fact on the ground will speak for itself. And also, they call the Hamas, the Hezbollah, and the other resistance group terrorists. But the word terrorism or terrorist is very, very, very subjective. A terrorist to me could be a freedom fighter to you, any of you. A freedom fighter to any of you could be a terrorist to me. It depends on the angle at which we are looking at the issue. So from the Palestinian perspective, whether Hamas, Islamic Jihad, whatever you call them, these people are genuine freedom fighters. In the eyes of Israel and the West, these people are terrorists. Let's have it clearly. But the 2006 war between Hezbollah, it's called the Lebanese War sometimes, but the war was not fought between the Lebanese state and Israel. It was fought between Hezbollah militants who were in control of the south after their expulsion of Israel out of the region against Israel. But Israel did not discriminate between what was Lebanese government infrastructure and Hezbollah infrastructure. There's a claim that Hezbollah hide within the civilian population of southern Lebanon, and that is a war crime. Fine. That cannot be denied outrightly. But does two wrongs make right? Because we saw the bombing of civilian infrastructure from bridges to airports to hospitals. If a state that thought itself to be fighting terrorism begins to violate laws that states are obliged to uphold, that state itself becomes a terroristic state. So I wouldn't shy away from saying the fact that Israel is not just a criminal state, Israel is a terrorist entity. If Israel wants to be seen as a genuine state, it should honor the laws of wars, attack your enemies, discriminate between civilians and military targets, and will respect you as a genuine belligerent in war. But so long as women, innocent women and children continue to bear the brunt of Israel's firepower without mercy, without consideration, I will say point blank, Israel is a terrorist state, and anyone who backs it is only backing terror. I don't exempt America from this accusation. It's a clear fact. You show the criminal, you're a criminal. Aiding and abetting. Whatever crime Israel commits, there's American footprint in it. But then, can we also absolve Hezbollah for the aggression of 2006? No. The attack on the Israeli outpost that led to the war is equally criminal. On that ground, Hezbollah as equally head. But then let's look at the scope. The attack was proportionate. It was a military target they struck. If Israel had retaliated, targeting military target of facility of Hezbollah, fair deal. But to bomb civilian infrastructure is quite condemnable and abominable. And then, having gone through the issues of the conflicts, there's another terminology that is very, very common with the Middle East diplomacy and politics. It is simply normalization. Normalization in this sense simply means Arabs recognizing Israel as a bona fide entity. Arab states recognizing Israel's legitimate right to exist. But this recognition or normalization is equally one-sided. The international consensus on the issue of Palestine and Israel, which is at the root of Israel-Arab conflict, has been that Israel must withdraw to the pre-1967 borders, must withdraw to the territory it had before 1967 conquest of Jerusalem and certain certain territories, because Jerusalem is seen as a disputed territory that have to be discussed later. Because the Palestinians want the eastern part of Jerusalem as a future capital, as a capital of their future states. But even within Jerusalem itself, we've seen series of ethnic cleansing and attempt to eradicate the Arab population. And Israel has institutions, I must admit. It has the parliament, the judiciary, the features of democracy. They're very strong. But all Israeli institutions, including the judiciary, are part and parcel of this apartheid system. So we cannot begin to selectively accuse one institution to favor the other. They are all part of a calculated attempt to subdue the Palestinians, control them, bully them, in fact, eliminate them. And I find it very surprising that Holocaust is being choked around our neck. That when you deny Holocaust, you are seen. When you denied Holocaust, you are seen as a vile person who has committed more crimes. Okay, for we wouldn't deny Holocaust because we can't deny it. It happened. Yes, it occurred. But does your past experience of violence, of crime, legitimize you committing the same crime? This is a question we should ask the proponent of Israel, the defenders of Israeli crime today. Does Holocaust legitimize Israeli apartheid? Does Holocaust legitimize Israeli ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from their lands? Does Holocaust legitimize Israeli jailing of minors, not adults, in adult prisons? A typical example of a discriminatory law in Israel, for you to understand why when I say Israel is an apartheid system, is that there's a law in Israel that allowed the Jews who were there, who have claim to lands, to go to court, to go to Israeli court. The law allows them to go to Israeli court, claim ownership of such lands from whomever, mostly the Palestinians. But the same law that allows the Israeli Jew to go to court and reclaim land he purports to be his or hers, denies the Palestinian the same equal right to go to court and reclaim land from any Jew he purports to be his or hers. Can you see the discriminatory system I'm talking about when I say Israel is an apartheid system? If the law wants to be fair, if Israel wants to be seen as a democracy, then the law shall apply squarely. If the Jew can go to court to claim a land from the Arab, why can't the Arab go to court to claim a land from the Jew? So the word normalization means recognizing Israel. But this recognition is unconditional. You need to recognize Israel even when it doesn't recognize the right of the Palestinians to have their state. Because there was a consensus among the Arabs that they would withhold recognition of Israel until it accepts the pre-1967 international consensus of going back to pre-1967 borders. But over the years, some of these Arab states have also prioritized their own domestic or national consideration above the interests of their fellow Arabs from Palestine. So the first country to sign a peace treaty with Israel was Egypt. Mind you, I told you the Yom Kippur War of 1973 resulted in a stalemate. So part of the negotiation, in the first Swiss War, after the Swiss War, Israel was in control of the Sinai Peninsula, which is an Egyptian territory. And that was why the Egyptians came back for the 1973 war. It was a surprise attack against Israel. The Yom Kippur is actually a Jewish public holiday. It's a religious holiday. So the Egyptians felt that they could attack Israel unexpected. They led the attack along the line, some series of miscalculation affected them, and then Israel also bounced back. So then there was this, recognition of a simple reality by both the Israelis and the Egyptians. The Egyptians realized that on one hand, they are not an equal match for the Israelis. Secondly, they would never gain international support. And when I mean international, I still mean Western support. As against Israel having such support. And then for the Israelis, they realized that to secure their border with Egypt, they must acknowledge one reality, that Egypt will always come to fight for Sinai Peninsula. So now having recognized our point of departure and our point of convergence between these two countries, through the effort of America, they signed a peace treaty in which Egypt recognized Israel, and in return, Israel ceded back Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. And the Egyptian leader who signed this peace treaty paid for it with his life. That's Anwar Sadat. And it must be known that while some Arab countries have dealings with Israel, even within those countries, public opinion is largely against Israel. Even America's allies in the region like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, and the likes have public opinion largely against Israel. And America suffers from the same backlash because the people do not see a distinction between Israeli crime and American endorsement. So for them, America is part of the problem. And so on the next slide, I think you see where I listed the countries that have been friends with Israel Arab friends. Egypt was 1973, Jordan was 1974, UAE was 2020, Bahrain was 2020. The recent ones are under what we call the Abraham Accord that was signed under Donald Trump. And that is the foreign policy success of Donald Trump. We can't take that away from him. He may have gotten it wrong domestically. But in the realm of foreign policy, this is a success. We can't deny Trump his credit on this. Those are the two countries that signed the agreement on the Middle Eastern aspect, on the Asian aspect of Asian side of the Middle East. But then on the African side, Morocco and Sudan equally signed up that Abraham's Accord.
Mr. Suleiman.
Yes, please.
You promised to share the slides so that we could follow, but then up to now you haven't. Could you just do that?
I sent her the slides.
Okay.
But then there is something I was supposed to do, I couldn't finish. So I told her after the whole thing, I will send her an updated version. I don't know if she could share this one. So later when I send the updated version, then you also have it.
Okay, we thought that as you did it, you have a live stream, share it while she spoke so that the participants could follow as well.
Okay. So let me hold on so you can find out from her if she has.
Okay, but you continue. I'll just find out from her.
Okay, find out from her. But there was something I'm supposed to add, the references and the couple of books you can also read for your future for further understanding of the conflict. So I wasn't able to do that due to time. So I told her I'll send her an updated version with the references and other recommended books.
Please continue.
Okay. But then in Middle East, the conflicts are multiple. They converge and diverge within the same theater of battle, within the same domain. So within one realm, you have the old historic Arab-Israeli conflicts. Within the same Middle East, you have a series of confrontation between the Saudi-led Arab alliance against Iran, which is taking more of a sectarian twist, Sunni Shia political rivalry. Within the same domain, you have US-Iran confrontation. I think if you follow international events, you will remember the assassination of the Iranian General Qasem Soleimani. It's all part of this US-Iran tension within the region. So there are multiple conflicts within one region. So I'll be taking it also one at a time. I'll be starting with the Iran-Saudi Arab tension. When I made mention of the countries, categorizing them into based on their system of governance, I highlighted Iran and Saudi Arabia as theocracies and made mention that one is a monarchical theocracy, the other is a theocratic monarchy, the other is a theocratic democracy. That is Iran being theocratic democracy, Saudi being theocratic monarchy. And I also made mention of the fact that Saudi Arabia is a Sunni power within the region. Iran is a Shia power within the region. And historically, this sect of Islam have huge differences. The initial difference that surfaced immediately after the demise of the Holy Prophet ﷺ was political. It was about who will succeed the man. But mind you, per Quranic injunction, the prophet is the seal of prophetship or prophethood. So it's called Khatam al-Nabiyyin, Khatam al-Anbiya. That is the seal of prophethood. So the successor in this context will only inherit. But when he was alive, in as much as he's the messenger of God, he was equally a head of state. He was a legislature. He was a chief judge. So in absence of his personality, there was a vacuum within these three core functions he performed, aside his spiritual function. The need to be a head of state. There was a vacuum in his legislative role. There was a vacuum in his judicial role as a chief justice. So there's a need to fill the vacuum. Then there comes the Muslim camp divided into two. Historically, some would say divided into probably four. That is quite debatable among Islamic because we have the issue between the migrants and the indigenous of Medina, that is the Ansar al-Muhajirun, but that's not related to this per se. So one faction felt that the leadership of the Muslim community after the demise of the Prophet should be elective. They became the Sunnis of today. The other factions that remain a minority and still remains a minority are what we call the Shias of today. They felt that leadership should come through the bloodline of the Prophet. Mind you, all his children died during his lifetime, excluding his daughter, Fatima. She was married to his cousin, Ali. So those who first accession should come through the bloodline wanted Ali to inherit the mantle of leadership of the Muslim community. And those who wanted leadership to be elected wanted his close friend and companion, Abu Bakr, to be appointed as a leader. The majority, being the Sunnis who wanted the office to be elective, succeeded in having their ways. And after Abu Bakr, we had Umar as the next Caliph. The word Khalifa itself means successor. And then we had Uthman and Ali. But you see, after the death of Uthman, now Uthman was killed in office and Ali succeeded him. Ali was being pressured to produce the killers. He couldn't because he has no evidence. He was also assassinated. And there's a lot of confrontation between two sides. But along the line, the origin of the division was political, as I said. Along the line, it took a sectarian divide, a sectarian twist. So as it is today, both sides have huge theological differences. And this is what is stoking the tension between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And quite fortunately or unfortunately, depending on where you look at it, if you look at it from the Iranian perspective, it's a fortunate situation for them that in every Sunni majority country in that region, there is Shia minority. And that Shia minority has constantly suffered oppression at the hands of the Shia and the Sunni majority Muslims. That's on the fortunate side for Iran. The unfortunate side, and then the fortunate side for the other Arab party is the fact that all the Sunni states equally have a Shia minority they have to deal with. So Iran initially was a monarchy, but in 1979, the king, he was called a Shah, that's the title for the monarch, he was overthrown. And a radical revolutionary Islamist regime came to power in Iran and had a crusading concept. Their goal was to spread a revolution similar, an idea similar to theirs across the Gulf, which technically means overthrowing the Sunni monarchies across the region. And this, agitated the Sunni monarchies. Hence, there was this bandwagoning. All Sunni Gulf states, they are very smaller. They are smaller population. The UAE, the Qataris, the Bahrainis have small populations. So they all coalesce under the might of Saudi Arabia. And then, but prior to that coalition, in the chaotic aftermath of the revolution in 1979, somewhere in 1980, Saddam Hussein invaded Iran. And there was a fight for 8 years, actually. The Sunni monarchies, being scared of Iranian promise to export its concept of governance, its newfound ideology, its newfound religious creed into their domain, backed Saddam Hussein with logistics, finance, arms, training, because they saw it as an advantage for them to overthrow the revolutionary regime. Unfortunately, the war resulted in a stalemate after 8 years of bloody conflict. And for the Iranians, it taught them two lessons. Prior to the advent of the revolutionaries in Iran, Iran was a large importer or recipient of US arms. When they overthrew the king, they held US diplomats in Iran hostage for 446 days, if I'm not mistaken, but more than 400 days in Iran. US diplomats were held hostage. And this is equally controversial. To the Americans, these are genuine diplomats. But mind you, these diplomats include the CIA operatives. And we all know CIA operatives to be technically military men. So I don't know how they become diplomats. But so long as they have diplomatic passport or credentials, they will legally be considered as diplomats. But for the Iranians, the so-called American diplomats were spies. Because in 1953, something similar to what happened in 1979 occurred. The Iranians, somewhere in the 50s, overthrew the king, and the American government, through their British allies, overthrew the elected government and restored the king back to his throne. And in the Ghanaian palace, let me say, his second coming. In his second coming, he became more brutal and more tyrannical than in his first existence, first stint in power. So when they finally overthrew him in 1979, there was this fear by the Iranians that US will use its influence within the military and the embassy to overthrow the new government, just as it did in 1953. And that was why the Iranians decided to invade the US embassy building and capture the American diplomats and held them hostage. So from the US perspective, those held hostage are diplomats. From the Iranian side, those so-called diplomats are spies. You get to see the difference of understanding and different lens at which the issue is being viewed, depending on who you ask and who you tell. So post that Saddam Hussein-Iran 8 years war, the Iranians realized that two things had happened. When we were fighting Saddam Hussein, US had sanctioned them because of the hostage taking. US had imposed arms embargo on them, so most of the US arms they were using, they couldn't afford to buy spare parts, they couldn't access spare parts on the market. And then they lacked enough weapons to fight. So post that war, they embarked, and they also realized that the Arabs were ganging up against them. So post that war, they invested their effort into two projects. One was domestic arms producing industry. And today it has paid off. Iran has the largest missile stockpile in the Middle East than any other country combined. It has military advantage in certain domain, but that does not make it invincible. And second lesson they learned is that they are Farsis or Persians in the Sea of Arabs. And since they don't have state allies, they must begin to develop alliances. And how do they seek to achieve the alliances? Sub-state actors. Now remember I said that in each of the Sunni majority country, you have Shia minorities that have been oppressed. So Iran took it upon itself to be a protector to the Shia Muslims across the world. Just as it is today that Israel has taken it upon himself to be the protector of Jews across the world. And once you are a Jew from any part of the world, you can go to Israel and claim citizenship. Iran took it upon itself to protect the Shias across the world. So Iran started building, started forming, arming, training, and financing Shia entities across these Gulf countries. And the most successful project, the most successful outcome of this project so far is the Lebanese Hezbollah. As we speak today, the Lebanese Hezbollah is not just, it's a political party with its own armed forces. It used to be a political party with a militia. But anyone who understands military affairs a bit would admit that today Hezbollah is not just a party with a militia. It's a party with a standing army that acts as an expeditionary force across the region for Iran. So we have the only state ally they had in the war was Syria, because the Syrian ruling family at that time and up till now is a Shia family. So they built two projects, created proxies, asked the West called them proxies, that these are Iranian proxies being used by Iran to achieve its nefarious political objective within the region. To the Iranians, these are legitimate allies that ascribe to its own doctrine. An Iranian doctrine sees the Iranian supreme leader as overall guide of Shias across the world. And then over the years, there've been this attempt to weaken the alliance between Iran and its sub-state actors through economic sanctions. And it has not worked because in the case of Iran and its allies, the first bond between these two groups, that is Iran and its, for lack of a better word, proxies, because to the Iranians, these are allies. To the Arabs and America and the Western world, these are proxies. It's always dependent on who you talk to and who you tell. For the lack of a better word, let's stick to the word proxy in quotes. To the West, the West are very materialistic and they view every culture to be materialistic. They think money can go anywhere and do everything. They think the bond between Iran and this group is financial. So since 1979 up to date, they have been pounding Iran with sanctions upon sanctions upon sanctions to weaken her grip over this group. The question is, it hasn't worked. Iran is today more stronger than it used to be in the past. The question which we ask ourselves is why? Because the bond is first of all theological, it's secondly ideological. The monetary benefit that comes out of it is just a reward. It's like what they tell us that they say, and I'm quoting, in quotes, we don't go to school to make money. We go to school to acquire knowledge, empower ourselves, and money will become the reward we get for that process. Likewise, in this balance, in this context, the reward, the financial reward, the military support, the moral support, whatever you call it, that these people get from Iran is not their core objective. It is only, what do you call it? An addendum, a benefit that comes out of their spiritual devotion to the supreme leader. That is why the sanction have not been able to divide these groups. And then we've seen it that Iran, for example, I know if you follow international affairs, you will understand that there's a conflict going on in Yemen. It's been going on for 7 years, almost 7 years now. When the Saudi decided to embark on their mission, the prince, the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, promised a 3-week operation. It's been there for 7 years. And if you look at the belligerent on the ground, the Houthi rebels, who are in control of the northern part of the country, are backed by Iran. The internationally recognized government is backed by Saudi Arabia and its Arab allies and the Western countries. But beneath the surface is the fact that the Houthi rebels are Shia, so they are under the protection of the Shia overlord, Iran. The other side is Sunni dominated, is under the influence of its overlord and protector, the Saudi Arabia. So you could see that despite the fight for power, it is equally a confrontation between two narratives, the Iranian promoted Shia doctrine and the Saudi-backed Sunni doctrine in the region. But then, let's try to make a clear distinction between these so-called Iranian proxies. I'd like to put something in perspective. In the international media, everything has been lumped up together. But if you look at the power play or the influence of these groups, some groups don't technically constitute a proxy. For example, the Houthi rebels today that are being backed by Iran have been fighting the central government in Yemen even before the Iranians got involved. They had alliance with the overthrown president, Ali Abdullah Saleh, and nearly took control of the Yemeni states. So now, these are a group of rebels, in bracket, because depending on who you talk to, they see themselves with legitimate government or fighting a legitimate cause. with a control of a definite territory, who have imposed their own government and administration on that territory. So in as much as they are liable to one or two, influence from Iran, I don't think they absolutely subject themselves to Iranian control, as in pay obeisance to Iran without imagining their own interests, because they have a territory and a state to administer, and they're administering it very well. And so far, militarily, after 7 years of war, it looks as if they have the upper hand. So the Houthi rebels wouldn't really fall under what we call a proxy. They look more of an ally than a proxy. And also, in as much as the two factions, the two groups are Shias, the Houthis and the Iranians, they also have sectarian and sub-sectarian differences. The Iranians are 12 Shias, the Houthis are Zaidi Shias, and one will not accept the doctrine of the other. Hezbollah initially would be a proxy, but Hezbollah today is more of an ally than a proxy. Because Hezbollah is virtually in control of the Lebanese state. Hezbollah, by intervening on the side of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, has gained more leverage in its dealings with Iran and Syria. And so Hezbollah is practically a state within a state. And that gives it more room for maneuver in its dealing with Iran than any of the militia groups that are fighting under direct Iranian command in Syria. Because in Syria, Iran has two paramilitary groups fighting there. And the third one is formed by Iranians under the control of the Syrian government. National Defense Forces are under the control of the Syrian government. But the Liwa Fatimiyun, you see, the Prophet has two granddaughters. Now he has a daughter called Zainab. Now he has a daughter called Fatima. I think he has another one called Zainab. I'm not mistaken, either a daughter or a granddaughter. And because the Iranians always cloak their policies with some religious veneer, they give you some religious massage or graces to make it look as if religious sometimes is just purely political, though. But religion tends to play a very fundamental part of their narrative. The two interventionist groups they send to Syria were given names that resonate with Shia populations across the world. One is Liwa Fatimiyun, the Fatimid Brigade, which is made up of Afghan Shia recruits who are fighting on behalf of Iran and Syria. Liwa Zainabiyun is made up of Pakistani and Indian Shia who are fighting in Syria on behalf of Iran. So these groups are under the direct control of the Iranian advisors on the ground. So these groups constitute a proxy. But in the instance of a group like Hezbollah or the Houthis, who have territories they administer, who have states they have been able to capture, directly or indirectly, these are more of allies than proxies. But in the international media, I think the era has been always seeing them as proxies, as if they partner to every decision Iran makes. No, they have some leverage than others. In Iraq also, they have a couple of militias that alternate between proxies and allies. And we've seen the confrontation in Syria is one when the civil war started. Before the coming of Russia into the war, we saw the likes of Iran backing the Syrian government because the Syrian president of the ruling family is of a Shia Alawite family. We saw the Sunni monarchists like Qatar, Saudi Arabia, backing, the Sunni rebels, and that sectarian drift between Saudi Arabia and Iran. But Bahrain is equally a very unique country, just like Lebanon. In Bahrain, the ruling house is a Sunni house, but the Sunnis in Bahrain are minorities. The majority of the population, about 70% of Bahrainis, are Shia. And so when the Bahrainis rose in protest as part of the larger Arab Spring, we saw the Saudis intervene and quash the revolt. And I think it was this quashing of the revolt in Bahrain that gave them the thought or confidence that they could do this, they could replicate the same thing in Yemen. Not forgetting that in Yemen, the situation is quite different than the, the Bahraini case. So I think I've spoken a little on the Iran-US confrontation. No, Iran-Saudi confrontation. Now, let me go back to I think I've spoken also on the Iran-US confrontation. That stems from, no, okay, let me say, I don't know, I can't remember, but let me talk on the US confrontation then. But the role of US in the region, it's a dominant one. As the most powerful country in the world, which was largely dependent on oil from Middle East, US had interest, invested troops, has military bases in the region. One of the largest US naval bases, the Fifth Fleet, based in Bahrain. But you see, today, Saudi is US strongest ally in the region. Prior to 1979, Iran was actually the strongest US ally in the region. Prior to the 79 revolution, the Iranian Shah was an ally of Israel. And this is one of the reasons why the population were angry and when he was led to his overthrow. In 1953, when the king, Muhammad Reza Shah, was overthrown, the British interest was endangered. US backed, British MI6. The CIA backed the British MI6 intelligence to overthrow Prime Minister Mossadegh, which was the leader then, and restore back the king to power. And that was the first operation that CIA actually took in overthrowing a government. It is called Operation Ajax. And then when the king came to power, when the king was restored to power, he became more tyrannical, more brutal than his previous stint. And along the line, lost public support and confidence. The revolution itself was equally not just religious. It has multiple actors, the secularists, the Marxists, the liberals. But the Shah was able to arrest and detain every member of this group. But he couldn't deal with the Islamists because the mosques were enormous in Iran. As a Muslim majority country, as a very religious country at that point in time, the mosque constitute a network that the Shah could not police effectively. So the Islamists became dominant. So in the aftermath of the overthrow of the Shah, the Islamists ousted their other collaborators or other allies prior to the revolution out of power and gained full control of the state. But realizing that in 1953, it was US embassy and the CIA involvement and the British participation that restored the king to power, a group of students who call themselves student hardline followers of the Imam line invaded US embassy, held the diplomat from the US side. If you're coming from the American narrative, the diplomat hostage. If you're coming from the Iranians, if you're looking at it from the Iranian perspective, the spies hostage. The interim government felt that was diplomatically wrong, and the supreme leader at that time, Khomeini, shouldn't endorse the hostage taking. But Khomeini calculated very well that the hostage taking might be bad for Iran's global reputation, international image. It was good for him politically to strengthen his hand in the aftermath of the revolutionary chaos. So he sided with the hostage takers, and the provisional government had to resign. That sowed the seed of US tension. In the Iran-Iraq war, Iran was under US embargo, couldn't get spare parts for its weapons. Saddam Hussein was acquiring American weapons through American finances and other friendly countries, like other, hostile countries to Iran. So to every Iranian who fought in that war, to them the war was Iran against America. Saddam Hussein was only just a means being used by US to fight them. And that is why up to date, the Iranians don't see eye to eye with America. But it's quite very strange, very interesting that everyone sees himself to be the victim. The US considered themselves to be the victim because it was Iran that took their diplomat hostage. The Iranians also see themselves to be the victim because it was Iran that restored the Shah in power in the first place for him to become more tyrannical. It was the same US that backed Saddam Hussein in his war against them. It is the same US that kept quiet, mute, and vetoed every attempt by Iran to hold Saddam Hussein accountable for the use of chemical weapons against the Iranian population. So the distrust between Iran and America is deep-seated based on certain understanding or different understanding of the situation. So to the Iranians, they are the victim of US aggression. To the US, they are the victim of Iranian hostility. And then there is also the Iran-Israel conflict within the same scope. I told you it is one theater with multiple battles, multiple war fronts, different actors, same actors, different objective, overlapping goals, converging goals. But you see, despite the hostility between Iran and US, anytime their interests converge, they collaborate. More like, what do you call it? Alliance of benefits. No, first with benefits. So when it diverges, they clash again. Anyway, in politics, there's one thing they say. Every student of politics will tell you. In politics, there is no permanent enemy or permanent friend, but permanent interest. A specific example was that, you see, when Saddam Hussein was defeated, both the Iraqis and the Americans disliked Saddam Hussein. So what they did was Iran has more influence on the Iraqi exiled politicians, and America had power on the ground. So they collaborated in forming a Shia-dominated government. That's where the collaboration is. That's where it ends. But when Iran realized that America was trying to gain foothold and secure a military presence in Iraq, mind you, Iran feel encircled. US has presence in Qatar, it has presence in Bahrain, it has presence in what do you call it, in Saudi Arabia. So they saw, and by then US was also present in Afghanistan after the overthrow of the Taliban. Even the Taliban was also an enemy to Iran. They saw it as another attempt by US to encircle Iran. So, sorry for that. They decided to end their collaboration with US just at the forming of the government, and backed and created militias that continue to attack and fight US troops in Iraq until it finally left. Another instance where they've collaborated despite their hostility is in the fight against ISIL. But in the slide, I use Daesh. Daesh is the Arabic acronym for ISIL. So if you're using the Arabic acronym, it is Daesh. If you're using the English acronym, it is ISIL, or Islamic State, IS for short. So in the fight against IS, both the US and Iranians wanted to protect the Shia-dominated government in Baghdad. So they had this gentleman agreement in which Iran provided, the American trained Iraqi army evaporated totally when ISIS launched their offensive. Although the root cause of the grievances that led to that has a lot of political factors. It also stems from the policies of the Shia-dominated government in Iraq. But that's not our concentration for today. But the US trained Iraqi army vanished from the battlefield, just like in Iraq, just like they just vanished from the battlefield against the Taliban in Afghanistan. Well, that perhaps should raise another question. How good is US at training or building armies for foreign countries? You can't train two armies, back two armies, arm two armies in two different countries, and they vanquish and evaporate into the thin air in the battlefield. But that's a question for another day. But what I'm saying is that, you see, because they are, in as much as Iran and US are rivals, they are enemies. In Iraq, their interests converge. They need to protect the Shia-dominated government in Baghdad against the marauding Islamic State militant or Daesh. So what they did was that Iran restructured its militias that it was using to fight against US occupation. armed them, and then there was this call by the leading Shia cleric in Iran, this fatwa. Fatwa is a religious edict that a Muslim scholar can issue over certain issues or challenging questions to the Muslim community or Muslim Ummah, the Muslim world, as the right word, Muslim Ummah. The fatwa made it a religious duty for Shia youth to rise up and protect the Iraqi state. After issuing that edict, Iran used it as an advantage to form multiple aligned groups, armed and train them to fight against Islamic State. And so the fighters on the ground, aside the restructured Iraqi army, but one of the most effective elements in the war against Daesh were the Iranian-backed militias. Once they were fighting on the ground, doing the dirty work on the ground, paying the price on the ground with their blood, the Americans were providing them with air cover, close air support, intelligence, and surveillance information. So can you see that despite their hostility, in instances where their interests converge, they've always cooperated mutually. But even when they were fighting ISIS collectively, both sides knew who would attack each other. It tells you that in politics, interest matters than friends or enemies. Then the Iran-Israel conflict is simple. All Arab governments refused to recognize Israel until some did in the latter years. But the only country that has proven vociferous, proven its aggression, its unrepentant stance against recognizing Israel, and has stated it categorically and overtly without the sense of political correctness, is Iran. Iran does not shy away from telling the world it's seek to expunge Israel, it's seek to eliminate Israel, it's seek to destroy Israel. And it has missiles pointing to Israel. And almost if you look at the range of almost all Iranian missiles, Israel falls within the range of those missiles. It tells you Iran means business when it talks about dealing with Israel. But because Iran is not militarily strong as Israel and does not have enough air power as Israel, Iran has been able to back proxies. As it uses them, I'm using proxies in quote because it depends on who you see. If you're talking to a pro-Iranian person, they are allies. If you're talking to a pro-American person or pro-Saudi person, they are proxies. So I'm using proxies in quote for the sake of neutrality, in quotation mark. You are all at liberty to decide on how you see them. I have my own view on them, but then it's to me. So one of such group is Hezbollah, and it has proven very effective against Israel. It forced Israel to withdraw from the Lebanese territory. It held Israel to a draw in the 2006 war. Another such group they fund and arm is the Palestinian militant group Hamas. They also have the Palestinian Jihad they back. So they back multiple groups in their fight against Israel, in their determination to back Israel. And almost all Arab states have ceased giving the Palestinian arms. Now they only provide them with financial, logistic, and some form of diplomatic protection. The only country that has remained unrepentant in arming Palestinians is Iran. And then when the Syrian civil war erupted and Iran deployed troops and militias within Syria, Israel felt threatened that Iran was becoming closer to its territory. And then Israel also embarked on bombing campaign across Syria. So Israel has constantly bombed Iranian posts, whether real, perceived, or identified. Once they think it's Iranian facility in Syria, it's bombed. It's part of that proxy war. You bomb me in Syria and deal with you. But within this also, there is quite a detente. For example, after the 2006 Hezbollah-Israel war, per international estimate and intelligence, Hezbollah is today more stronger than it used to be in the past, more armed than it used to be, So Israel knows it cannot outrightly defeat Hezbollah in a battlefront. Hezbollah knows it cannot outrightly defeat Israel in a war. And that is what is keeping the peace at the northern borders of Israel. The day one side thought it could defeat the other, we go back to the warring situation. So there's this unwritten agreement. Israel continued to bomb Hezbollah in Syria without Hezbollah retaliating. But anytime it bombs Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hezbollah retaliates. And that has made Israel to restrict its bombing only to Syria. Although with some exceptional cases, it bombs the Lebanese side and takes the hit back. But each response within the Lebanese space is calculated not to push the other to a threshold of pain it cannot contain. So Israel selectively bombed. There was this bombing that was carried out, in which the first bombing was on a Hezbollah convoy. The second bombing was delayed by a 30-minute interval, deliberately knowing that before the second bombing raid could take place, the Lebanese militants, the Hezbollah fighters would have left the car or escaped. So it was meant to pass a message, because had they been killed, Hezbollah would have been forced to respond due to internal pressure from its own supporters. And likewise, there was the response from that attack by the Hezbollah, and they deliberately fired rockets into open space in northern Israel, meaning it's a deliberate attempt to avoid casualty, because any casualty will have imposed pressure on the Israeli politician and the Israeli state to also exact revenge. So you could see how they calculate, escalate, and de-escalate the tensions themselves within the region. That is on the, what do you call it, the Israel-Iran proxy wars. And then I think this is where the slide ends. But I wasn't able to make the update. I'll do it and then send it to you guys. But let me quickly chip this in. But one thing must be known, and categorically known, that can Middle East afford to be in war in perpetuity? I don't think so. We need to talk. How does this happen? Who facilitates it? I don't know. At this moment of saber rattling here and there, belligerent posture, bellicose rhetoric, I can't tell. But I think the Middle Eastern country or the Gulf countries will do themselves a favor, because another thing, even within the naming of the Gulf, the pro-America and pro-Arab people call it the Arabian Gulf. Iran and its allies see it to be the Persian Gulf. But historically, that region has always been known as the Persian Gulf. See, they must first of all accept. Those who recognize Israel, I would say, have foresight. Those who refuse to recognize Israel, I think, are equally living in denial. Whether you recognize Israel or not, it is a political reality on the ground. You must deal with it. Israel will equally help itself if it understands that having a peace agreement with your neighbor is the best security you can have, and not the number of arms you procure for yourself. Because so long as you trample upon the right of the Arabs, they will still resist you. So Israel can best secure itself through dialogue than through confrontation. And then over the years, there have been this attempt by the Western countries to weaken Iran or minimize Iranian influence in the region. And there's this attempt to use force by the Sunni monarchists to protect their regime. I think it is naive approach. It is an unrealistic approach to use force in trying to, address a domestic security problem. They can best weaken Iranian influence in the region if they begin to respect the right of their Shia minority. Because Iran does not create enemies for Israel or US or the Saudis and the rest. Iran only identified disgruntled elements within this country, group them together, reorient them, train them, and arm them. And since sanctions have not worked, it tells you that the best way to weaken the Iranian narrative is first of all not to create the conditions that produce this enmity or hatred in the heart of the people that Iranians get to use. So the Sunni-dominated country should begin to respect the rights of their Shia minority citizens, and that will prevent Iran from gaining a foothold in their country. That will prevent their country from looking up to Iran for protection, and that will prevent their Shia population or Shia minority from looking up to Iran for protection. And then also, the Iranians must equally understand one thing, that US is actually a guest in the region. One way or the other, when its interests become less precarious, or when the Middle East lost its value in the eyes of America, America will withdraw and go back to a new space. So whilst US is a visitor or a guest in the region, the Saudis and the Iranians, the Saudis and the Israelis must understand that they are neighbors and will always be with each other, and they can best protect themselves through dialogue and not through arms or clash of steel. I think I would like to pause on my presentation here, and then I don't know if there are questions, then we see how well we can deal with it. I hope you guys enjoyed the presentation.
Thank you very much for session. We have a lot of questions coming in, so I'll scroll up and start from the first one, and I'll read it out.
Okay, so I will plead that we do it this way, one at a time. I get to answer so that I don't get to forget.
Okay, sure. Okay, so let me get the first question. The first question is it necessary to say that the precursor to continuous conflicts within the Middle East is the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1918, which divided the greater part of the former Ottoman Empire between the Russian Empire, the British, and the French?
Yeah, Sykes-Picot is part, because it divided those countries without looking at the historic, what do you call it? Historic. Sykes-Picot is part. It divided those countries without looking at the historic, what do you call it, relationship within the region. It's just like the arbitrary nature of the borders in Africa today. That cut ethnic groups across most countries. For example, we have AOS in Ghana, AOS in Togo. It was just a line drawn at Berlin. So Sykes-Picot is part. But the root, Sykes-Picot's role largely affects the Arabs against the Arabs than the Arabs against Israel. A typical example I said was that Lebanon was part of historic Syria and the Ottoman Empire. When the British were given the mandate, for administrative convenience, okay, it decided to partition the country into two. The British took what became Syria. The French took over what became, what do you call it, Lebanon. And, in the course of Lebanese independence, prior to the independence, a referendum that was held. The Muslim majority of Lebanon actually voted to be added back to Syria. But the French, being Catholics, have some sentimental feelings or soft spot for the Maronite Christians, decided not to honor that agreement and leave Lebanon intact. So on paper, the Syrians tend to see Lebanon as an independent entity, but in reality, no Syrian born of a Syrian woman, born of a Syrian blood, has ever recognized that border as legitimate. And the border itself is still hard to predict. It's still undemarcated. It's very rugged, very mountainous, and undemarcated around the Kalamun Range. So the Sykes-Picot Agreement actually trade conflict between these Arab states than it creates between the Arabs and Israel. Typical example of with the Sykes-Picot, another tragedy, is the issue of the Iraq invading Kuwait in 1999. At a certain point in time, Kuwait was part of historic Iraq. So Saddam Hussein invasion of Kuwait to him was a cause of rectifying historic error that stemmed out of the lack of understanding when Sykes-Picot agreement was being drawn. But to the outside world, the international community, as I always say in brackets, it is an aggression. But historically, these are people with similar culture who have been together. So Sykes-Picot tend to affect inter-Arab relationship than Arab-Israeli relationship.
Okay, I hope your question is answered. So the next question here says that, what are the inherent divisions between the Sunni and Shia, which has largely resulted in present-day division and desire to control Middle Eastern politics?
The first point is about the role of the leadership in the Muslim community. The Sunnis believe in Khilafah, the Shia believe in Imamate. So in the Sunni doctrine, anyone can emerge and lead the Muslim world. In the Shia theology, only descendants of the prophet, have the legitimate right, the spiritual right to lead the Muslim community. And also to the Shia, whom they call imams, the imamate. So to them, Ali is the first Shia imam. Hassan is the second, Hussein is the third, chronologically to that order. To the Shia, the imams are infallible, just like the prophet was infallible. And then another very defining moment in the Shia theology that makes it very difficult for US to contain the Iran today and its Shia allies is the issue of martyrdom. Islamically, the martyr is very much revered. Martyrdom is very much revered in Islam. That when someone dies as a martyr, there's this spiritual cleansing of a body we do before we bury them, before we shroud the Muslim in the white garment, we take them to the burial. But martyrs are not cleansed spiritually. They don't go through that process of birth. It is believed that God has already done that for him. They have already been purified by God. That's how sacred martyrdom is to Islam. So when someone dies in the battlefield or in any of those kind of things, all you do is you pick the body, shroud him in the white, you bury him. But any other thing else, you have to take him through the spiritual cleansing before you shroud him in white. But in the Shia doctrine of martyrdom, it has another layer. It has an element of justice in it. You know, the Prophet had grandchildren through Ali and Fatima, Hassan and Hussein. Hassan being the eldest. When his dad was killed, and the Usman family, the Muawiyah clan, took over the control of the Muslim state, Hassan acknowledged the rule of Muawiyah as head of the Muslim community. But Hussein refused and was invited to Karbala. I can't remember the exact year, but he was invited to Karbala by the people of that community, and they promised to help him in his revolt against the Muawiyah clan, that is the Osman clan that have taken over control of the Islamic State at that point in time. But Muawiyah being the leader chased Hussein and his group of followers to Karbala, and he was killed. Hussein was killed in Karbala. And henceforth, and he was killed on a very particular month, the 10th of Muharram, which is Ashura in Islam, in which Muslims are advised to fast. He was killed on that sacred month, 10th of Muharram on the Islamic calendar, and he knew he was on the minority, having less support, but decided to fight. That marks a different crucible for the Shia Islam, that the fight for justice cannot be compromised on any basis. It is the duty of every Shia to emulate the footsteps of Imam Hussein, knowing well that he has little support. But because he believes his cause to be just, he embarked on it. So for the Shia, the world is between the forces of light and the forces of evil. And so for them, justice, martyrdom is very, very important. That is why in the doctrine of the Iranian Revolution, to die is to serve, is to live, than to live. So when they were asked that, was it in Iraq or Lebanon? I think a Shia Hezbollah militant was asked. I was an Hezbollah militant, that what defines your life? And he said, to be on the Hezbollah side, our death defines how we lived, rather than our life depending how we died. And when the deputy Hezbollah commander, Hassan Nasrallah is the general secretary, Deputy General Secretary Naim Qasim was asked, why does Hezbollah continuously fight Israel even when it is the weaker party? And he made one mention. He says, which is partially true, per se. Due to Israeli population, the small number of its population, Israel always seek quick victory to avoid large human casualty of war. So he said, kill one Israeli soldier, all the generals begin to cry. That is the first point of departure. For them, preservation of life. For us, preservation of principle. What is the life? What is the value of a life of occupation? So, whilst the Israelis are thinking about protecting life, they don't care giving up their life for a principle they believe in. So, because in the Shia doctrine, martyrdom is very, very, very revered, and the issue of the Imams being infallible, it's another special thing that distinguishes the Sunni Muslim from the Shia Muslim. And then there was this Khalif along the line, I can't remember, it seems he succeeded his father Muawiyah, Yazid. Yazid became so tyrannical that to mention the name of Ali was more like a crime against the state, and people were dealt with. And the Shia also, as a sign of defiance, continued to mention Ali. And that is why today, when we Muslims make the Shahada, there's a clear distinction between the Shahada of a Sunni Muslim and the Shahada of a Shia Muslim. In the Sunni Muslims, it's simply Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. I bear witness that there's no God, like a God with a small g, or no deity worthy of worship except Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. But in the Shia doctrine, after saying Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah, they add wa ana aliyyu waliyullah, which is a clear distinction also between how the Sunnis recite their Shahada and how the Shia recite their Shahada. But you see, the Shia adding one aliyyu waliyullah was for historic reasons. Around the time of Yazid, the name Ali became a rallying cry for revolt against state authority. So the mention of the name Ali was banned. And for them, as a sign of defiance, as a sign of commitment to their religious belief, as a sign of commitment to their belief in the infallibility of the Prophet family, they call Ahlul Bayt, that is what the Sunnis, that is the name for Prophet family among all Muslims. But in the Shia, Ahlul Bayt hold more reverence because they see them to be infallible. As a sign of defiance and commitment to the issue of the Ahlul Bayt, they added that aspect to it. Wa ana Ali waliyullah, meaning, and I testify that Ali is God's beloved. aside making the testimony of no deity, no one being worthy of worship except Allah, and the Prophet is his messenger, they add Ali to it, which is another clear distinction between the Sunni and the Shia. And even in terms of prayer, I have actually not seen the Shia praying before. I've not been privileged to go to their mosque and see them praying. I'm a Sunni Muslim, but then I've tried as much as I can to read a couple of their books. There are a lot of erroneous things that Sunnis have peddled about the Shias that I think perhaps, which I don't really think is genuine. Because in the books I have read, I have never seen where they have said that when the angel brought prophethood to the Muhammad, he should have given it to Ali, he mistakenly gave it to Ali. He should have given it to Ali and mistakenly gave it to Muhammad. That's one of the things growing up as a Sunni I was told about the beliefs of the Shia. But when I embarked on my own curiosity, on my own attempt to read and understand the other side of my faith, I never came across that in their books. Perhaps it's limited to the books I have read, but I still believe there is more to be read about the Shia faith. But so far, these are some of the differences between the Sunni and the Shia. And also, the Shias technically pray 3 times a day. We Sunni Muslims pray 5 times a day. We both pray 5 times a day, but technically they pray 3, we pray 5. We pray in intervals, the one at dawn, the one around 12, getting to 1, the one in the evening when the sun is about to fall, the one we do around 3, getting to 4, that is Asr, Maghrib, when the sun sets, and Isha. But the Shias pray the dawn one separately, combine the 2 afternoon prayers into 1, and then combine the 2 evening prayers into 1. So once they have prayed 5 times daily, now once they have prayed 3 times daily, in terms of structurally they pray 3 times daily, but technically, if you call it prayed 5 times daily, that is the issue. That's another point of departure. And we pray without putting anything on the floor, on our forehead. But before they pray, where they prostrate and put their forehead, they put anything that is made of earthly material, either clay, sand, or so. Because they believe that the Prophet prayed on natural earth and not on a cemented floor, something like that. So these are some of the distinctions between the Shia. And then the issue of hadith. After the death of the Prophet, multiple of hadiths, multiple of narrations and quotations were attributed to the man. There was the need to distinguish which one is genuine and which one was non-genuine. So the issue of hadith being Sahih and being Dahif, and the rest. And then so Sunnis follow certain hadith collectors or collections of Sahih Bukhari authentic hadith, collections of Muslim, Imam al-Tirmidhi, Imam Malik. But the Shias don't subscribe to these hadith collectors. They use the hadith of Jafari. So also have difference around that area about the hadith and how it's interpreted. These are some of the distinctions between the Sunni and the, Sunni creed. But mind you, even within these 2 sects, there are subsects. It's also a bit of, just like normal Christian, we have denominations. So we also have that trend within Islam.
Okay. We have the last 2 questions. This one says that, so even with the ideological differences between Sunni and Shia, are the Shia allowed in Saudi for Hajj, such that for the purposes of religion, they could reach a ceasefire?
Well, the Shias are allowed to go to Hajj in Saudi Arabia. The only sects that find it difficult to go to Hajj is the Ahmadi sect. And that is because they are in breach of a fundamental Islamic principle. And so we Muslims technically don't consider them to be Muslims. It is only non-Muslims that see them to be Muslims. But Orthodox Muslims don't see them to be Muslims, see them to be deviants. That is the Ahmadi, because part of their belief is that their founder, Ghulam Ahmad, is equally sent by God, a messenger of God. But that contravenes an Islamic injunction, which is in the Quran, in which it is stated that the Prophet is the last in line of prophets that God has sent. Khatam al-Anbiya. By saying Ghulam Ahmad is a prophet, it contradicts that core Islamic value, that core Islamic belief. And so to Orthodox Muslims, they are not considered to be Muslims, so they are not allowed to come to Hajj. But then I would like to add this, that on a personal basis, I don't see them to be non-Muslims. I don't have a problem with Ahmadi, but I cannot stand behind an Ahmadi and pray, because he has defied that fundamental belief which I hold. But beyond that, I have no hostility against any Ahmadi. I don't think we should have hostility against Ahmadis. I don't even think we should be hostile between Sunni and Shia, pulling through a knife on each other's throat. And also, and I use the Quranic verse, I can't remember the exact quotation of the Quran, but it says, Lakum dinukum waliyadin. There was a point in time when the non-believers in Makkah came to see the Prophet that you've been criticizing our gods, our way of life. So let's come to a compromise where for 1 year we join in worshiping your God to all your practices. And in the following year, you compromise and join us to worship our own God in our own way, in our gods in our own way. And the Prophet was categorically told, Lakum dinukum waliyadin, that since the Makkans wouldn't accept what you believe and you wouldn't accept what they believe, today be their faith and to you be yours. Then there's another verse in the Quran that says, La ikraha fid din. There is no compulsion in religion. But I'm sure if you understand religion very well, in its essence, when Christianity refers to religion, it refers to itself as the only religion that God has sent for man's salvation. That's why Christians say, if you don't believe in Christ as a savior, meaning every other religion is falsehood. I'm not saying that that should lead to hostility, but that's the cardinal belief. Likewise, Islam says another religion aside it is falsehood. That is fundamental about religion. And that's why religion has created division across the world. So if you really understand religion in this context, then you realize that when Islam says like ikraha fid din, there is no compulsion in religion, it is not referring to any other religion by itself. So technically, that means there is no compulsion in Islam. And so long as there's no compulsion in Islam, it is not in my right or in my place or in the place of any other Muslim to determine who is a Muslim or is not. Once he or she has stated La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah, that is what makes one a Muslim. As to how he chooses to practice that La ilaha illallah, as to how well he or she chooses to follow the Muhammad Rasulullah, is up to the individual. But fundamentally, no one wants to go to hell. I don't even think Pharaoh or Hitler, despite all their crimes. I don't know for the crime of Pharaoh. We've heard this from spiritual sources. We can't, we can't tabulate, we can't calculate the victims, we can't measure. But at least Hitler, despite the 6 million Jews he killed, I'm not sure would want to go to hell if he's given the choice of choosing between heaven and hell. Look at the narrative, the bleakness of hell, and the luster of heaven. I don't think he would want to go to hell. So everyone wants to go to heaven. It is our means that differ. So I don't think it's in the position of any other Muslim to tell any Muslim he or she is a Muslim or not. Tell him or she that you can come to Hajj or not. But on a fundamental ground, I can't pray behind an Ahmadi. I have nothing against him. But by breaking the core principle of Khatam al-Anbiya, I can't stand behind an Ahmadi and pray. But we can live as any other human beings. No problem.
Okay, so the last question reads, in the diplomatic world, it seems that allies want to make the Palestinians and Israeli live as one state instead of the division that exists. What is the reasoning behind this? And is there really any hope for success?
Well, Islamically, the notion of a non-believer is quite debatable. Islam refers to Christians and Jews as people of the books, because Islam acknowledges the existence of past prophets like Moses, Jesus, Solomon. But perhaps in terms of context, functions, and role, it differs. For example, Christians believe Jesus is the Son of God, which we Muslims do not believe. I believe Jesus is a prophet of God based on my religion. Christians believe in the Son of God. But any Muslim who deny the existence of Jesus, we don't add Christ to it, and it's Jesus, forfeits being a Muslim. Because you cannot be a Muslim until you believe in the past books. It's part and parcel of the religion. But then over the years, there's been this theological expansion of that meaning by Islamic scholars to say that the Christianity that Islam was referring to those days are monotheist Christians who believe in one God. They didn't believe in the issue of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Trinity wasn't part. So in that case, a Christianity that believes in Trinity of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit ceased to fall under the category of people of the book. But if a Christian believes that there is just one God and does not believe in Trinity, then he qualifies as the Christian that the people of the book is in reference to. And then, no, if you look at spiritually, I would say what in the spiritual world we see in the Bible and the Quran, of those in other religious scriptures rather, is limited to the Middle East, around that small expanse of space. The only part of Africa that surfaces is probably Egypt and Ethiopia, around that terrain. And if you look at it, you see that there have been no stubborn people than the Jews. But let's make a clear distinction between Judaism as a religion and Judaism as a political philosophy, which is called Zionism. Judaism as a religion, even before the creation of Israel, the Arabs and the Jews have always lived in that land peacefully. But we all know the issue of the Crusades, the conflict involved, and that has been used to tag Islam as religion that was spread by the sword. And those who accuse us of spreading Islam by the sword also gave us the Spanish Inquisition and the Jewish pogroms. And they want to make it look as if only Muslims are killing Jews today, where Christians have killed a large number of Jews, the Jewish pogroms in Eastern Europe. But that's another point in time. But let's distinguish between Judaism as a religion. Jews have always been part and parcel of that region. They have lived with Muslims in that region historically. Even when Ottomans were in control of that region, the region has special status where the Christians have access to their place of worship. The Muslims have. The tension you are seeing today is as a result of political Judaism, and that is what is unacceptable to the Palestinians, and that is why I don't subscribe to. I believe that it is wrong to have cleansed yourself of a burden in Europe and dumped them in, in Israel. But then if I'm from Europe, now if my grandfather is from Europe, I was born in Europe as a child, brought to Israel, grew up in the current Israel, and I give birth to my children. It doesn't make sense for someone to tell me I have to go back to where I'm from. I'm not from there, I'm from here. You get the point? So I believe that Israel has a right to exist based on the fact that two mistakes or two wrongs does not make right. But I believe only in conditional recognition of Israel. So long as Israel does not recognize the right of the Palestinians to live, I support any move, be it force or peaceful means that the Palestinians seek to use to liberate themselves. But I'm against targeting civilian targets. I'm against war crime. But any decision of the Arabs that they use to liberate themselves against the clutches of Zionism and Israeli terror, I support it. Israel, if it is back at the pre-1967 border, fine. Arabs and Jews living together in this charged political atmosphere, that is fallacious. We are seeing rising tension between Sunni and Muslims in that region. And these are people with common belief. How do you bundle people with opposing beliefs together when those with common beliefs can't even relate peacefully? It begins to tell you that the issue of people living together, and another thing that discredits this argument is equal the issue of Cyprus. You know, Cyprus has a large Turkish population, indigenous Turkish population. Mind you, Ottoman Empire once ruled Greece. It's quite outside Middle East, but it's part of the point I'm building. And so they were Turkish, in what is Greece and Cyprus today who are indigenous of this place. There were Greeks who are indigenous of what is Turkey today. But in the creation of Turkey after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, there was this population exchange that all Greeks who were in the part that became Turkey today had to move after the Greeks lost their military adventure against the Turkish nationalists. And all Turkish that were in the part that is Greece today moved to the other side. So it might interest you to know that Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the first president of Turkey, was born in Thessaloniki, in Turkey, in Greece, which the Ottomans were calling Saloniki. So he was technically born a Greek, died a Turkish. But for Cyprus, the population wasn't swapped. And there was this tension between the Turkish side and the Greek side. And there was a mutual agreement between British, France, I think Italy and Turkey, over protecting the interests of the two communities to live harmoniously. But in the 70s, the Greek government influenced the Cyprus military to overthrow the elected government in order to integrate or incorporate Cyprus into Greece. The Turkish government intervened militarily to secure the interests of its own Turkish people, since it's their own protector. And ever since Turkish invasion, I think in the late 70s, we have this division between this Greek Cypriot Republic, which is the internationally recognized government of Cyprus, and then North Cyprus Turkish Republic, which is only recognized by Turkey. And there have been series of negotiations to bridge the gap between these two groups in order for them to coexist together peacefully. And it has failed because these are people who cannot be reconcilable based on culture, based on belief, based on aspirations. In as much as they've lived together, the political scenarios that has charged and changed the atmosphere makes it practically impossible to only lead to postponement of the war, but it wouldn't end the war. So even if within Europe, there is a lot of tension between the Greek Cypriots and the Greek Turkish, how much more in a land that is not just about a geography? You know why the Middle Eastern war, the Palestinian issue resonates? The Dome of Rock in Jerusalem is the third holiest site to Muslims. So even if Israel desecrated and invaded with troops solely because it is crushing Palestinian resistance, it also sends another message of violating a sacred Islamic place of Islamic, facility. Because that is the third holiest, we believe the Prophet ascended to heaven through that mosque. So the third holiest shrine in Islam. So it is not just a political issue, it has a religious underpinning. And that makes it practically impossible for these two people to live together. And if Israel had treated its own Arab, some Arabs refused to migrate and they stay. And funny enough, the Jews returned after a million years or so to reclaim their land. They are telling children of parents who have left as a result of the Israeli wars and conquest, who are now refugees in Lebanon and other parts of the world, not to return. So you have the right to return after a million years. Some people don't have the right to return after 70 plus years. Can you see how biased and how myopic the conscience or the thought of the Israeli is? You have the right to return after millennia. Someone has no right to return after less than a century. And moreover, Israel treated its Arab citizens who refused to leave very well by respecting their rights equally, placed them at par with its Jewish population. That would have convinced a Palestinian to accept one state solution. But if I'm a Palestinian, seeing how abused towards, how well do you then convince me to accept that you and I can live as one entity? So Israel, in its track record, has not proven that it could treat the Palestinian population well. And that's why the Palestinians will never accept anything to do with Israel. At best, Israel should expect them to accept the pre-1967 border. At worst, Israel should expect them continuously harbor that belief that they must kick Israel out. And then, secondly, the religious aspect of that whole thing is that the more you enter the sacred ground, the more you agitate Muslims across the world, it gives Israel less support in the Muslim world. Although I don't have hostility towards Israel, I only disagree with its policies. I have no hostility towards any nation. I can disagree with your policies. I disagree with Israeli apartheid system. I disagree with Israeli selective approach to the law. I disagree with Israeli discriminatory policies. I disagree with the notion of using Holocaust to justify another war crimes or violation of people's rights. I also just believe in conditional recognition of Israel. I would only recognize Israel, and I only support recognition of Israel on the basis that it recognizes the right of the Palestinians to self-determination, to have their own state. Anything contrary to this recognition from Israel of the Palestinian right is equally amount to a forfeiture of each right in my own sight to exist.
Thank you very much. This was a well-given speech. I'm sure all of us who joined the call have learned a lot because it was really informative and we can apply that in our debates. So after we end, which we'll do shortly, we'll get the concise presentation from Mr. Suleiman and we'll send it to you through your email so that you can now have access to it and revise at your pleasure and at your time. Once again, I'd like to thank you, sir, Mr. Suleiman Bello, for your time to come and educate us on Middle Eastern politics and security. We are much grateful. We will leave here with more information and our debates will be more informative. Thank you once again for your time. So we'll end the meeting now. If you have any concluding remarks, say you can say it now. If not, we'll end the meeting here.
Well, I just want to say that it was nice being part of the program. It was nice hosting you. I like to share my knowledge with people. And then I think the only thing I have to say is that to understand the Middle East as it is, we shouldn't always just depend on what we hear on the mainstream media. They most of the times have an agenda. There is no way BBC would promote British in bad light. There's no way CNN will give America a bad light. For example, we all saw footages that purported to show Saddam Hussein having chemical weapons by BBC and CNN when America decided to invade Iraq. But up to date, these countries have not been able to prove the existence of such weapons because it doesn't exist. It tells you how sometimes international media are biased towards their host country. But then that is patriotism. I can't love Ghana less than any other country. If I begin to love Ghana less than any other country and begin to promote the interests of that person, I'm a bad Ghanaian. You can't love your neighbor more than you love yourself. I'm not sure it's the same in the Bible because the Quran says none of you is a believer until he loves for his brother. No, that's an hadith of the prophet. None is a believer until he loves for his brother what he loves for himself. So love your neighbor as you love thyself, that's said in the Bible, said in Islam in a different light, but the same core message. So they equally have an agenda. So we should always have an open mind. Because I took my own initiative to look at the issues from different angles before I came to a conclusion. Like I said, I was born in a Sunni family. I'm still a Sunni. I would have believed in some of the fallacies we've been told about the Shias, but I decided to go deep. So I've been able. There are times when I talk and people say, "No, you're a Shia," and I'm not a Shia, but I understand the angle they are coming from. So let's try as much as we can to always go beyond the surface of the issues and look at the deeper underlying issues that will give us the chance of getting a clearer picture. Because, like I said, a terrorist to me is a freedom fighter to you. A freedom fighter is a terrorist to me. So if you want to judge between the two of us, how would you do? You must look at my narrative, look at her narrative, look at the means with which we choose to achieve our goals, the means begin to tell you whether the end is a terroristic end or not a terroristic end. Or the end might be positive, but if the means has terroristic element, they begin to know who's a terrorist or who's not a terrorist. But if you just look at it from one side, one narrative, she's a terrorist, you believe she's a terrorist. Another person look at her narrative, she's a freedom fighter, she's a freedom fighter. We'll never get a clear picture. So let's always try to have open mind in pursuing not just Middle East as a whole, international politics as a whole. And we should go beyond what government says and look at what government actually do. There's one thing they say, politics and policies don't always work in the front line. And funny enough, when politicians want to deceive us when they mess up, there's only one word they use for it: political expediency, political exigencies. So let's try and look beyond what government says and focus on what government does as a way of judging what they say. We juxtapose and then we understand. That's all I have to say. May God bless all of us. God bless Ghana. God bless you all. And God
Thank
bless the
you
world
very
and give us a
much.
very peaceful environment.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for joining in on today's session. Please have a good day. Goodbye.